Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. We are studying the nouns and the manner they are used in sentences in Arabic language. Obviously, the purpose is that we are able to understand the language of the Quran directly. I mentioned the fact that in Arabic, Arab carry a very significant value position in explaining what kind of role a certain noun is playing in a sentence. And for that purpose, we have already familiarized ourselves with the identity, the appearance of the three types of Arab. We have talked about Rafa, which is the nominative case. We've talked about Nasab, which is the accusative case, and we've talked about Jar, which is the genitive case. We have seen how they change their appearance when they are used from singular to double or plural, masculine to feminine, etc. We've also discussed the use of Rafa in all the four possibilities wherein a noun takes the form of Rafa, the nominative case. We then started talking about Jar, the genitive case, even though logically it should have come only after the discussion on Nasab, which is the accusative case. But I mentioned that because in the case of Jar, there are only two cases to be discussed, and there's a long list of possibilities in the case of Nasab, the accusative case. We will first take care of Jar and then move on to a longer list of possibilities. So, the discussion on Arab has taken us to the understanding of Rafa, understanding of Nasab and Jar. But at the moment, we are now trying to figure out as to what are the practical possibilities wherein nouns take different forms of Arab. I have mentioned in the last discussion that when it comes to Jar, there are only two possibilities. In this case of genitive case, we either have huruf jar, the letters which are particles normally used for their own meanings, but they're also used as prepositions of verbs. So, for example, I just mentioned toward the end of the last session, when you say Zahaba Zaidun al Masjid, Zaid went to Masjid. Like Daraba Zaidun Khalidan, Zaid beat up Khalid. But here, because Zahaba, whenever it would appear, would require the services of its preposition ila to come before the noun, which is its object. Ila is one of the huruf jar, the particles that when they come require that the immediately succeeding, coming later noun takes the form of jar. So when ila would come, al-masjid would become al-masjidi, and there is only one harakat on masjid. I'm sure by now you know, it's because of alif lam restricting the possibility of harakat to only one. Now we move on to the next of the possibility of jar. We've talked about huruf jar, which was the possibility number one, and now we are going to talk about murakkab izafi. Murakkab is actually composite nouns. There are two nouns that put together convey one sense. But this murakkab izafi, it normally has two nouns, and one of them is called mudaf and the other is called mudaf ilayh. So we have mudaf and mudaf ilayh. Don't forget that we are talking about it because we have to talk about another possibility of jar, of Arab taking the form of jar or genitive case. Mudaf is the governing noun and mudaf ilayh is the governed noun. Now the idea is that we have to, in this particular case, give an expression which is conveying the understanding of the possessive case. So what we are saying is that there is a noun that governs, possesses, call it owns another noun. So in English, for example, when we say, if I might put it here, Zad's house, Zad's house. These are two nouns, and this particular symbol is obviously our apostrophe, which is actually giving the meaning of Zad possessing, governing, owning the house. In Arabic, what happens is that house, well, obviously, the direction that the English language takes is completely the opposite of Arabic. So in English, you write from left to right, and in Arabic and Urdu and Persian, it's from right to left. But if you go by the English sequence, Zad comes first, and house comes later. Now, Zad is mudaf, which is the governing noun. House is the one which in Arabic is going to be mudaf, and Zad is going to be mudaf ilayh. So in Arabic, if you look at it, considering that we move from right to left, the sequence is reversed. The house would come first, and Zad would come later. Now, as I said, mudaf is the governing noun. The governing noun. And mudaf ilayh is the governed noun. Now, bayt is the noun, is the asset, or whatever else nouns can mean, is the one which is owned by Zad. The theory is, the philosophy is, that the noun which is possessed by somebody is the one which has caused the reason for the expression to be used, for the communication to take place. Had there been no house of Zad, there would have been no discussion on the topic. And therefore, the idea is, the logic is, that the mention of house should precede, should come first. And that is what happens in the case of Arabic. Now, what happens is that you have only one harakat on bayt, on mudaf, the governing noun. Now, ordinarily, you have only one harakat when there is alif lam immediately at the beginning of a noun. If there is no alif lam, then normally you have two harakat which are expressed by the understanding of tanween. But when you are talking about mudaf, despite the fact that the noun is not preceded by an alif lam, it has only one harakat, like it is here over here. This harakat, by the way, coming towards the end of a noun is actually the i'rab, showing the i'rab of this noun as well. I am putting over here dhamma, which is in actual fact rafa, not because of any particular reason. Normally, when you do not have any reason, you assume that it's rafa, but you can also put a nasab or a jar here. But the important thing is that in the case of mudaf, it's only one harakat. In actual fact, if you allow me, I could go a step further. It is actually the omission of the sound of noon. You know, if you pronounce baytun, there is a sound of noon. You remove that sound and it becomes baytu. Now you might say, what is the point in saying it like that? Well, very soon you would realize, and probably it makes more sense that we say that a mudaf, the governing noun, whenever it appears, it does not have a sound of noon at its end, towards its end. The reason why we're talking about it is, the whole discussion is because mudaf ilay, the governed noun, always takes the form of jar. That is what the discussion is all about. We're discussing the possibilities of jar, and here is the second possibility, which is mudaf ilay. Whenever there is going to be a composite noun wherein you have mudaf, the governing noun, and mudaf ilay, the governed noun, mudaf ilay, the governed noun, is always going to come in the Arabic form of jar. It's always going to be in the genitive case. So, baytu zaydin, by its very construction, is going to give the meanings of Zaid's house. So, you know, like when we read in English, Zaid's house, and we look at the apostrophe mark, immediately what comes to our mind is Zaid owns, possesses the house. Likewise, this jar over here, preceded by a noun which has only one harakat, despite it not having an alif lam, is an indication of the fact that it is a composite noun. It's a composite of nouns which has the meaning of possession, and that is what mudaf ilay is all about. And we will take more examples of it, but I hope that we are a little clear about the idea of governing noun mudaf and governed noun. Now, let me take you a step further, and to justify what I had only very recently said, that in mudaf you do not have the sound of noon. Imagine Zaid has two houses, not one. Can you figure out what exactly would be the word for two houses when the noun is to appear in the form of rafa? It is in the nominative case. I hope all of you will respond by saying almost immediately that it should be baytani. Remember that baytun alimun is singular, and two ulama, two alim are alimani. So two houses are baytani. if it would have been nasab or jar, it would have been baytaini. So it's baytani. Now come back to this case. You want to say that Zad's two houses. How would you say that? You would say, let's put it freely first. No compulsions, no tension of how to do it correctly. Just putting down the two nouns, Baitan and Zad. Well, we already know that there is a jar here. But the trouble is that Baitani, when you pronounce it, it has a sound of noon because of noon itself being there. Just remove it because you do not have the sound of noon in the case of mudaf, governing noun, and what you're left with is Baita Zaidin. Now, alif followed by ta is going to signify, convey the meanings of two houses. Baita Zaidin. You want an example of plural as well? Let's say we want to say Muslims of India. Now, again, what we have is that you will mention the one which is the mudaf first. Now, this might be a little confusing because I've used of, which could actually be India's Muslims. Now, this probably might be more closer to what we have done earlier. We did Zad's house. Now, if you allow me to rub it off, always been horrible as far as this idea of using the whiteboard is concerned, but I hope you will bear with me. India's Muslims. So, when we use it, what we're saying is that we will use Muslim first, which is mudaf, and India, al-Hind, then, which is mudaf ilayh. Now, we know that the plural of Muslims in Arabic would be Muslimuna. The double of Muslim is Muslimani. So, when we say Muslimuna, we will say Muslimun al-Hind. So, India's Muslims, we're assuming that when we talk about Muslims, we're talking about Muslim men. Ordinarily when you talk about both genders together, until very recently, the norm, the tradition was that you would use the masculine gender. So I'm following that tradition. So Muslimun al-Hind doesn't make sense because you cannot have the sound of noon in mudaf, in the governing noun. So we drop this noon and we are left with Muslimul al-Hind. You might ask why this alif? Well, this is again a convention. When you drop the noon in the plural noun in Arabic, masculine, you put an alif. That's the convention. So, Muslimul Hind is again going to mean India's Muslims. And obviously, the reason why we are discussing all this is that Al-Hind is showing an Arab is in the form of jar, which is the genitive case. So, here we are with an understanding of mudaf ilayh. Now, mudaf ilayh is the other possibility why a certain noun will have jar, the genitive case in its appearance. Now, just let me take another interesting, a slightly more complex case wherein what we have is something a little more than what you normally find in the case of mudaf, mudaf ilayh, which is expressing possessiveness in a way that there is a dual relationship of one noun with two different nouns. In other words, there can sometimes be three nouns in a manner that they together are forming two murakkab idafi, two cases of mudaf, mudaf ilayh. There is one noun in the middle which on the one hand is mudaf ilayh of its preceding noun and is the mudaf of its succeeding noun. Well, examples always help. So what I'm trying to say is that, for example, if we say that Zad has a son, so it's going to be Zad's son, and that son has a house, so it's going to be Zad's son's house. Zad's son's house. So what we are having expressing over here is that we've got two nouns, in actual fact three nouns, and we have the governing noun and the governed noun, and in between we have a noun which is both governing noun and the governed noun. Now if we start the proceedings, we'll just simply write Bait, which is the house, which is, as I said, when we begin in Arabic to mention this composite noun, we start with mudaf, which is the governing noun. And in between we have son, which in Arabic is ibn. And then we have Zaid. So as far as the positioning, sequencing is concerned, we have done it. Mudaf, the governing noun would come first, and then it's mudaf ilayh, which is the governed noun. For the time being, let's forget about Zaid. The idea is that what we're saying is Baytu ibnin, and the meanings would be son's house. Like Baytu Zaidin was Zaid's house. Baytu ibnin is son's house. Now, forget about Bayt for the time being, and let's come here. And what you have is Zaid's son, which is Ibn Zaidin. Now it could be, as I said earlier, it could have been Ibn Zaidin, depending upon what Arab Ibn would take. Here we know for good reasons that Ibn is going to take jar, so it has jar. Now, because Ibn is mudaf of Zaid, it is the governing noun of Zaid, it cannot have the sound of noon coming towards its end. Therefore, it's Ibni Zaidin. You put all three nouns together, what you have is Baytu Ibni Zaidin, Zaid's son's house. So that is how mudaf and mudaf ilayh, which is called murakkab idafi, that is how it forms its structure, and the Arab are then playing their role. And in this particular case, obviously, we're talking about the Arab of jar. What we have done as yet, if we recapitulate, we have understood the fact that in Arabic there are two types of sentences. One sentence is where you give information about a noun, jumla ismiya khabariya, and there is another category of sentence which is the jumla failiya khabariya, wherein you have a verb whose information or about which information is provided. Now, when we talk about nouns, we talk about nouns the way they appear, taking one of the three possible Arabic forms. They can take one of the three possible cases when they appear in a sentence. They could either be in the Arabic form of rafa, which is the nominative case, or they could be in the form of nasab, which is the accusative case, or they can be in the form of jar, which is the genitive case. Now, we have talked about all the four possibilities why a certain noun could appear in the form of rafa, Arabic form of rafa. And we have now also discussed the two possibilities why a noun would appear in the form of jar. And the two possibilities are of harf jar, all nouns coming immediately after any of the huruf jar, any of the particles would take the Arabic form of jar. They are going to be the genitive case. And the other possibility is what we have talked about in this particular session, and that is the possibility that nouns come in the form of composite nouns. They are murakkab izafi, wherein one noun is mudaf, which is the governing noun, and the other noun is mudaf ilayh, which is the governed noun. And we have talked about the possibility where it is a little more composite, a little more complex, wherein the composition is actually in the form of both. May the Almighty enable us to understand His book's language properly.